If Canadian VCs weren't allowed to talk to journalists anonymously, they would never say anything. Hello, and welcome to another AMA edition of the BetaKit Podcast. This one is going to be a little bit special because, as you might know, we're streaming live on LinkedIn. So if you can see me, hello. And if you can just hear me, well, welcome to a normal episode of the podcast, whereby our listeners try to bludgeon us to death with submitted questions about Canadian tech and tech from a Canadian perspective. And Rob and I just try to survive in answering. You all know the rules by now, because this has become one of the most popular series of podcasts that we've done on the BetaKit Podcast, and we're trying new things. Is this ostensibly just a beta test to see if we can do live streaming on LinkedIn right before Elon takes over Twitter? Possibly. Will it be a great podcast experience? Time will tell. Do I have a glass of white wine sitting before me, ready to answer your questions? Almost certainly. But I guess, Rob, I need to introduce you as my co-host so people can see you now. It's a little bit different when I'm just nudging you on the pod. Look at that.
Hi.
A beautiful two-shot.
It's the future. We live in the future.
Just because Katie's not here, I think she's actually probably watching from home. She said she was just going to have a nice relaxing bubble bath and kind of chill out. Shout outs to Nathan, our streaming man extraordinaire in the background. You can't see him, but you're feeling his presence. But, this is a little bit different than what we normally do, Rob. This is super live. So we can't ask Katie to cut things, at least not live. How are you feeling about the questions that we had submitted before we get into them?
Okay. Oh, hello, first level connection, Douglas.
Yes. Yeah. This is where networking happens.
Okay. They're suspicious. They're not as hard as I'm used to.
They're not PhD level master theses questions.
No, we don't have to prove anything mathematically this time.
The questions that we got weren't the most complex, but that doesn't mean they're not bringing the high heat. And I wanted to start with this one. This was submitted anonymously. And the question was, why are people so fucking shy? And I think it's in reference to the majority of questions that we ask during these AMAs are usually anonymous or not sourced or cited. Sometimes we'll shout out a first name. In other instances, we'll directly note the person. But the vast majority of questions that we get asked and answer on this podcast, whether it's an AMA episode or otherwise, are usually submitted anonymously. I have my thoughts on why this is. But Rob, you're a founder, you're a man about town in tech. You've been podcasting for a long time. Why might you think that we're always choosing or receiving anonymous questions about what's happening in Canadian tech?
There's two reasons. I think they're both obvious and easy. First one is this is a very, very small community of people. So we can probably guess who those people are, but I think it's to be able to ask the right kind of questions. It's like anonymous sourcing, I suppose. It just allows you, and it allows you to ask the kind of questions you want to know the answer to. And then it rolls into the second reason, which is I think they want to stump us. They really want to stump us, and they don't want to
start.
They want to make us really sad, and they want to call us out to make us say things that they would never say. What do you think? Is that right?
No, I agree with both points. They definitely, Game of Thrones style, want us to know it was them, but they don't want anyone else to know. And given the size of the ecosystem and the players within, despite the size of our country, if Canadian VCs weren't allowed to talk to journalists anonymously, they would never say anything. And that's just the state of play that we're in, which, hey, leads us into our next question. Rob, why don't you jump on this one, which is not anonymous. Look at that.
It's not anonymous-ish.
Look at us.
So this is something we've talked about a bunch on this pod, but let's dig into it more. A lot of VCs hit the emergency brake in the first half of the year after the reckless growth at all costs 2021. So we've got a lot of dry powder pent up. Will we see a return to throw checks at everything and valuation bounce backs in 2023, or is it going to be a tempered return over time to capital flow? And this is from Danielle.
That's a great question. So the emergency brakes, the growth at all costs. We've been talking about this a lot on the podcast, usually with a friend of the pod, Tony Dagger, Anthony Mushanta from RBCX. Do we feel that they're going to return to the madness of last year? I would say yes, fundamentally, because that wasn't driven by like a desire to be reckless or just some weird, like, I'm feeling myself, it's like Scorpio season type situation. It was driven by market pressure. And as we've talked about a bunch of times, that was very, very, very low interest rates, cheap capital, and an influx of foreign direct investment leading to a huge amount of competition for deals. There was serious FOMO and there was capital that needed to be deployed. So do I expect a return to that? At some point, yes. As soon as those condition triggers allow for that craziness to happen. It's not like VCs in the moment were like, this is ridiculous. We're doing no diligence, or over the weekend, we have to make a decision on a company that we've never met before because Tiger's sending the one-page term sheet with no board request, outsourced diligence, and just like free money, basically. They knew it was crazy at the time. And I think they're very happy now to return to the pre-COVID, a little bit more staid approach. But that circumstance will return the minute the conditions on the ground lead to that competition. So a tempered return to capital flow is going to continue until such time as enough foreign investment enters into Canada to make it crazy pants again. Rob, as people might know, you are the 40-year-old founder. What is your perspective on this? What are you hoping for? Are you hoping for the throw checks at everything? Are you hoping for the growth at all costs? Are you hoping for a little bit more staid Canadian approach where all the VCs publicly and privately lecture everyone about who should get money and when and how much?
I think crypto notwithstanding. I'd say that, I think that the knife cuts both ways, right? If you're given these ridiculous valuations, you have to hit those ridiculous valuations. So the growth at all costs was a symbiotic circle of the entrepreneur and the venture capitalist and investor types pushing for that. So I think that having those crazy valuations forces that kind of growth. I like the sort of come to your senses. Maybe that's because I'm Canadian. Version of things where it's like, oh no, we're going to invest in some real businesses now for a while. That seems kind of cool. I'd say, like, to Danielle's question, I think there's two parts I'd sort of want to go back to. One is, I don't think we'll see a bounce back in valuations in 2023. I think you said the tempered return is tempered because it's going to be a recession. There's going to be a recession, and people aren't necessarily, I mean, we've talked about this in the show. BetaKit's report this a bunch of times from the stories that I've read. Are there going to be new funds over the next 5 years that are going to be investing in early stage? It's not clear. So that will affect what the valuations look like. So I don't think 2023 is the year to expect a bounce back. It'll be much slower. And then I also think, I keep seeing this stuff about dry powder. And my take, and at least what I've been hearing, is that dry powder is not going to be deployed to early stage new companies that may not have proven financial models. The funds that have put their money out want the ones that they've put their money into to succeed. So my thinking is, again, it depends on the fund and the stage and all that other stuff and how new the money is and how old the money is. But I think a lot of that dry powder is going to be follow-up money. So as the earlier stage founder, I wouldn't hang my hat on being like, unless you're Kirk Simpson, I'm not like, okay, I'm going to raise $100 million today, or Adam Neumann. Those are the exceptions that prove the rule.
Yeah. A couple of things here that are really important to note. And we talked about this, I think, just 2 podcasts ago. Like, business models aren't business models, they're business theories until they produce returns. And I think there's actually an important distinction between the growth at all cost mindset and what was happening to valuations, because the growth at all cost mindset has been existent since 2004, 2005, since Facebook and social apps led to land grab strategies. And we've seen this through Uber, through Airbnb, and all these other things, whereas like our goal is to not be profitable. It is to capture as much market share as possible and then figure out a way to be profitable, coinciding. And I think, Rob, you made the point on the previous podcast, like Snap basically saying, we're going public and we don't know if we're ever going to make money. That is separate slightly from the valuation explosion that we saw in the market that was driven by the cheap capital and the foreign zaniness, right? So like splitting those out is really important, as well as noting, is powder still powder if it's never used? If like the gun never goes off in the third act, is it actually powder? Or is it just an asset that you sit on? Or for some of the big like pension or mutual funds, you just reallocate to other asset classes that are much more viable. So I think that's a really important thing to note as we track what will continue and what will proceed. We have seen some notable funds close recently. You can read about them on BetaKit. Obviously, the government's been stepping in either through BDC or, hey, Vicky, everyone got their letter. Congratulations, you've been accepted into free money. I'm sure we'll be talking about that more going forward. I think it's important to separate why valuations were happening, why people were throwing checks at everything, and why there was a push for growth. And now there's like, hey, making money is cool again. Does that lead us to the next question that we received, also from Danielle? I don't know why this Danielle person is getting pole position for all these questions. If you've got a better question, suggest that you go into the LinkedIn chat and post it there. Okay, so this follow-up question from Danielle, which I think is correlated in where I was going to go next. We've seen a lot of companies grow their teams quickly over the last year, only to turn around and lay off during the crunch. Is this just a symptom of the times, or is this an indication of a larger problem of poor management, oversight, planning, and a lot of startups and scaling tech companies? I guess, Rob, do you want to take that in terms of past experience working at scaling companies, starting your own thing, matrix dodging the scenario?
This is not an or. This is an and.
Yes.
That's. I think that it's a false
You're
choice.
yes-anding everything.
Pretty much. I think like it follows from the point that you just made. It absolutely is a symptom of the times. It's grow quickly, lay off quickly. You have to conserve your cash flow. That's just the way that the fast-growing tech companies work. Is that right? That's a whole other kind of question. And then from the poor management and oversight and planning, yeah, I mean, there's, I think, a combination of, to your point, Douglas, also previously, there are theses. These things are built on a thesis. So you're taking a big risk. Will the thesis pay off? Who knows? Independent of funding, independent of climate, you might have bet on a company as an employer, as a founder, that's not viable, and you have to fix that. But oftentimes, I think we've, as an ecosystem in Canada, we're starting to have people who have more experience managing scaling businesses, which we didn't have, say, a decade ago. So there is some more maturity across the ecosystem in being able to manage and grow teams. But I have yet to see a scaling venture-backed company that has its shit together when it comes to managing people and growing them in a way that's sustainable, that's not constantly putting out fires. I think we're getting there, and maybe we need a couple more cycles to have that expertise. And maybe if we can import some of that talent, either repatriate people from the Silicon Valley ecosystem to help do that. But even then, I've worked with companies out of New York and out of San Francisco, and it looks like it's a real business. And then you scratch the surface, and it's like mass panic.
Elon walked into the Twitter office today with a kitchen or a bathroom sink. So like expertise or experience and where that's coming from, what are we really learning here?
Yeah.
But I'm actually going to be a little bit more fair and balanced on this because just last episode, and if you haven't checked this out, I strongly recommend it because it's probably one of the most fun podcasts I've ever recorded with the wonderful Alexis Gay, who is hilarious, talking about the video content that she produces as a send-up, homage, seen and attacked conversation around working in tech and business. One of the popular segments she had produced was the layoff CEO. Who could have known? How could we have foreseen that everything that we were doing this month would be exactly the opposite next month? And I think, to what we were talking about previously, if you are pursuing a growth at all costs model, if you're pursuing we'll get big and figure it out later model, you're operating under a thesis that doesn't expect bad times to happen. But I also know that there were several companies, particularly coming out of the pandemic, who thought they were seeing, whether it was Shopify or anyone else, fundamental changes to their market, their sector, and they were placing a bet to accelerate growth. Now, for some of those companies that really exploded in 2020 and 2021, it was the perfect time to do that. And then this year, for a variety of global economic, like we've talked all through all this, it was exactly the worst time to be pushing down the pedal that hard. So in some ways, put it this way. Talked to one VC in the ecosystem who had noted to me that they own a house in Toronto, which lets you know that they're a VC. And they had got called from their mortgage broker, bank or whatever. And they're like, hey, we're going to do a stress test on your mortgage. Basically, like, if things get a little shaky, can you facilitate this? And they did that at like a 2% increase in interest rates. Like, we are currently right now, as the Bank of Canada, I think, just announced that they're upping interest rates today, like 4 times beyond what the worst case scenario people were planning for at the end of last year. So I think timing is important and there needs to be a balance here, but also every employee should know if they're going into a company that's saying, hey, we're going to raise a lot of money, spend a lot of money, grow as fast as we can and hope it works out, that you're working for one of those types of companies. And you should go in with eyes open. So symptoms of the time and poor management and lack of oversight and crazy circumstances, all of the above. We've seen every company struggle with one of those things. So great questions, Danielle. We do actually have a question from LinkedIn, and I want to reward the participation late in the evening on a Wednesday on LinkedIn. Like, I don't know what you fools are doing here, but we appreciate you and value. So I'm going to throw to this and we're going to break off the normal track. I think this is from James McLeod, who is a former journalist, dude guy about town at the Council of Canadian Innovators, CCI. And he's asking us, I guess this kind of, again, thematically relates, talking about the before times, the current modality that we're in. What do you think the 2020s will be like for tech? The 2010s was the mobile revolution and SaaS. I would also say social.
Yes.
Social, yes, James.
Absolutely.
What do you think the defining feature of the next decade will be? Rob, I'm glad I took that one.
I was going to say.
Go ahead. I await your answer, sir.
Well, I'm going to tell you the answer. And
juicy question.
I'll be rich at the end of it because we're all going to place the correct bets.
Noting we don't have any sponsors for this episode, so I can't throw to a break to save you.
Yeah, thank you. Funny because I'm sponsoring this episode, the 40-year-old. Again, if I knew the answer to that question, we'd all be rich. I'd say obviously notwithstanding that 2010 started after a recession. We had 2 years and a half of a pandemic and we're about to hit a recession. So notwithstanding the first half of the decade might be a stinkier half. So I think an interesting question might be what the 2025s to the 35s. I have a theory about those, how there's the Gartner's hype cycle. There's like a hump of it and then the things go
I believe
away.
You've referenced it on the podcast
all
before.
the time. I'm in love with weird curves that aren't normalized. And so I think what you see with new technologies is those things come and go over time, and there's iterations of them. And we've talked about it on the pod about at least my theory about VR and blockchain and stuff like that. I think that the question is, when are those things going to hit, at least that we see coming? And depending on who you talk to, I think VR, we're not in the right iteration of VR. Maybe at the end of the decade, maybe that will be the right one. It might be too late for Facebook or Meta. Crypto, Web3 to be more precise or vague, I suppose. I still think we're early. I mean, I know a lot of VCs and entrepreneurs who disagree with me. I think we're even earlier than VR. So I don't know. I don't see it
even earlier
obvious.
than VR. Wow.
I think so. Yeah.
That's a statement to unpack.
I mean, I think we might see some tentacles, like we might see some plumbing. I think what we'll actually see is the manifestation of AI in a more day-to-day sense. And it might not be as obvious. We're seeing it in things like DALL-E and stuff, starting to kind of scratch the surface of something. But I think we'll see the full impact of AI by the end of the decade. And that will permeate every product and service that we have, whether we know it or not. How about you? Do you want to prognosticate and bet on black or red?
Oh, happy to. I won't make any bets because I don't have any money. I won't be rich. And I adhere to conflicts of interest. I've resigned to my fate of always being poor. So I'll say it's definitely not going to be VR. It's definitely not going to be the metaverse. It's interesting you're talking about all of the changes that James noted coming out of a recession. I would say this hasn't been like my favorite century so far. It's not like the previous 10 years. We were throwing in the high 90s. It's as a child of the 80s, it's particularly coming of age professionally, not the best circumstances. But it's definitely not going to be VR because I still believe that is technology in search of specific solutions. And it certainly won't be the metaverse. I know there's been a lot of reporting recently, like tech CEOs are now openly mocking the metaverse. Either was a dig to Mark Zuckerberg or just because they don't believe in it. Because again, I think that is a ecosystem and a platform in search of use cases. There's actually a profile of Neil Stephenson and his approach to the metaverse that just dropped today that I haven't read yet that I'm really eager to. Neil Stephenson being an amazing author that we should have on this podcast that coined the term the metaverse, a little bit as a cautionary tale. So when Meta and everyone else were like, yeah, we're just handing out this book, Snow Crash, to learn how to build the metaverse. It's like, I don't think you know what a dystopia is. Swords are cool though. But your conversation though about AI, okay, let's go to, Web3 versus VR first. I think that's really interesting because again, I think we've been pretty down on Web3 and crypto fundamentally on this podcast because we've yet to see, I think, a particular use case where it provides value beyond the current thing. And we're going to talk a little fintech in the back end. This is the BetaKit Podcast. We can't avoid it. But I still haven't seen a component of Web3 tech where I want that outcome. And I'm willing to pursue that outcome through that technological pathway. Very early days. It's interesting you say that, versus VR, because at least with VR and maybe perhaps AR, you can kind of see some value there. It's more the consistency versus cost versus strapping yourself into a thing versus, can Apple release the equivalent of the AR equivalent of the iPhone that kind of consolidates and centralizes that? We have to remember that, I worked in mobile tech for much longer than the iPhone existed. There's been 20 years of iteration on that before the first iPhone, which was the beginning of the mobile age. So the time spectrum scales out. But the conversation about AI is interesting because when we were looking for backup filler questions, just in case no one showed up or just in case no one submitted questions, spoilers, we might do that. What might we be interested in talking about? Definitely caught by the news that Shutterstock is partnering with OpenAI to integrate DALL-E 2 into their, inventory of images, which we're now talking about the fundamental unit economics of the internet, which is content, being generated a completely different way. I think there's a lot of generative AI creation things, whether it's the fake podcasts with Joe Rogan and Steve Jobs or deep fakes or things like that, where that's already happening.
Yeah.
It's already here. It just hasn't propagated and scaled, and we're not prepared for the ramifications of it, just like social. So when I look at this next decade, I feel like it is society coming to terms with the technology of the 2010s that has overtaken us and defined our age, where the most powerful person in the world bought Twitter on a whim. And this is why we're live streaming on LinkedIn, coinciding with the development of a new age of generative information creation through AI, through algorithms. I couldn't think of anything worse. I know there's a lot of founders who are really excited about the opportunities here, the coolness. I don't think they're doing any work to protect against the harm. And I feel like we are just going to be eating it for the next decade. So
two other things. One point I missed, and then one thing I want to just address the point that you made. One is I think that we're not going to hit our climate targets by 2030.
We're all going to die.
So
Sorry.
I think that the reactionary investment in climate tech or climate related stuff in the late 20s and early 30s will probably go up like crazy as a reaction to what the hell is happening in the world. But the other thing that is materially different than it was, and you mentioned this, but I kind of want to lean into this. This is not a technology, but it's a way a business works. In the early 10s, because the financial system crashed at the end of the last decade, that's why money is cheap. And money is not cheap. At least for the first few years of this decade, it's not going to be cheap anymore. So to your point about business models, I think that the kind of large amounts of capital, winner takes all, figure out the business model later, that might not be, at least for the first half or so of the decade, if not more. I think you're going to need to have a business that is an actual business, right? It has line of sight to revenue. That's not just, I'm going to do some stuff. That's not to say things like DALL-E can't exist with some speculative business model. But I think we'll see a lot less of those and a lot more of, this is a business, we need capital to make it go fast.
Yes. And I might have been in a conversation with a founder earlier this week about the cool generative AI tech that they're working on and how they're immediately looking to drive revenue from it, which I think is a reflection of the time. Okay, I think we covered off a lot of future prognostication there. What's next on the list there, Rob?
The next one is, let's talk about current future. This is a question from Jess. What do you think 2023 will bring for Shopify? Notwithstanding the fact that they're posting their Q3 earnings tomorrow as of the recording of this live stream / podcast. So whatever we'll say will obviously be out of date. Do you have any hunches or gut from what you think you'll see in a few short months out of Shopify, Douglas?
Well, my gut's telling me that we should continue to record these AMAs on Thursday evenings to ensure they're the most up-to-date as possible. We're recording this on a Wednesday evening, not only for like this kind of LinkedIn tech test that we're doing, but also in celebration of my birthday, I'm going to a concert tomorrow. So we couldn't do it for scheduling reasons, which is really fucking me right now. So I'm going to say, I know a couple things. I know some Shopify executives will no longer be working at the company, because in this last quarter, they announced they'd be replacing some key executives timed to the financials dropping tomorrow, including their CFO. I think that executive turnover will continue as Shopify looks to grow and replace some of that homegrown talent, people who had been there for 5 to 10 years, lifers, with globally experienced operators required to combat Amazon, Apple, everyone else. But maybe what I'll stick on is, we were also submitted another question, which wasn't really like a what will the future bring for Shopify, but more of like an interesting side bet that ties into the last thing. So I'm going to read this out. Again, submitted anonymously. What's up with that? But I think you'll appreciate why. If you were offered $10,000 worth of Shopify stock or Bitcoin, I'm assuming today, but you can't sell for at least 5 years, which would you take? Now, disclosures, I don't own shares in any tech company. I only own shares in BetaKit, because I would be heavily conflicted if I didn't. So don't take this as like also like investment advice either. I would say Shopify, because whether or not that company is going up or down, whether this is the right time versus like if you had one share of Shopify and whatever, or like I had some shares in Apple when I was in university and sold them to pay off tuition because OSAP didn't come through, and look at me now. Just fundamentally, like that company produces value. It enables other entrepreneurs to do things. It is a driver of commerce. That is, for whatever you say about the company, their implementation, some of the things they do, fundamentally cool. Bitcoin is just a thing. And that I don't believe in, that doesn't really provide any value, and is based on philosophically limited approaches for people to make more money. And I think we should really lock in, particularly as we get more remote during COVID, as we get more digital, remembering like the tangible value that things have. And sometimes like buying and selling goods and services is a little bit more interesting than Doug coin or whatever. So yeah, I would take the Shopify stock, which I can't, but I would.
Right.
I guess disclosure with that, I actually own some Bitcoin on a side bet with my cousin over one holidays where we got a little drunk and he showed me how to buy it. So there's a CoinSquare account with whatever amount in there, but it has no financial
probably $200 million and you just don't know it. You should probably look.
We'll update you on the next podcast about the state of my crypto holdings. But yeah, that would be what would your take be, Rob?
I'd say take the Shopify stock in a second. First of all, I agree with you. It's a fundamental working of our economy is allowing people to sell online. Now, there's going to be some dApps and stuff that allow you to do that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, in 5 years, first of all, when in the 5 years, is that a peak or a trough of Bitcoin's value?
5 years from today, sir. Don't finagle your way out of answering this
No, I'm
question.
just saying it doesn't matter. That day could be a crash day or a boom day. That's what the cycle has been like for the last 5 or 6 years. By the way, I don't think I own Shopify stock, and I don't have Bitcoin. I have some Raspberry Pis. I guess that qualifies me as a minor, but I don't know Bitcoin.
Is it a disclosure if your voice goes up an octave trailing towards the end of the question? I don't know. If I hit puberty during the question, that's the real marker. But I think that what's Shopify going to do? Shopify is going to go and pick the aspects of Web3, if it's Bitcoin or Ethereum or whatever, that makes sense for doing business online. They're a big company. So you're kind of going to get the best of both worlds. If there's something in Bitcoin, there's something getting Bitcoin out of the Shopify stock. By the way, I will say that to the question about the Q3 stuff, notwithstanding all the what's happening in the very short term, I can just feel we're gonna look like assholes tomorrow or Friday. When this thing drops.
Actually think. This what really matters is 2023. So, in my opinion, from what I'm not an expert here at all, and it's also like weird because it's a public company and we're talking about a public company, it's like a tech company, but a public. It's that they went crazy because everyone was going online for the pandemic, and now they've stopped going online. That was a bump for the pandemic. But are people going to be selling shit online till the end of time? Is it going up and to the right? I absolutely think so. I think that it'll be more about, how do they grow their product set, and do they need to acquire customers, or do they acquire companies to do that? I think
why acquire companies when you can just keep shotgunning cash into them? We just covered today.
Yeah.
They made their first investment into an Asia Pacific company. I think we had talked previously, like basically the day that they made their layoffs or announced their layoffs, like that week they had closed a $100 million investment in Klaviyo, an e-commerce content delivery competitor to MailChimp, which they had fought. I would expect in 2023, they will continue to make investments. And on that note, shout out Satish Kanwar, who's responsible for doing that at Shopify. Ran into him at the Omer's charity poker event last week. Just a wonderfully nice man. It was great seeing him. It was his birthday on the weekend. Happy birthday, Satish. And hey, yeah, there's a reason why this is a tech podcast, because as you were talking, Rob, I was pulling it up. Shopify's down 76% over the past year. So none of this is financial advice in the hypothetical situation that you would have.
In fact, we've sent it down 76% by having this conversation.
Yeah. TBD. Yeah. I guess the thing is, like, you normally, like, when our listeners get to listen to this when we release it, but we're actually doing this live. So when market opens tomorrow, I'm sure that this podcast will be directly cited as impacting their share price.
In the other direction.
Okay, Rob, again, future prognostication on Canadian tech darlings. This one's for you from, again, Jess, submitted first name basis, just pumping us full of questions. But shout out, because these were really good questions about Canadian tech companies and not the weird shit that we just like talking about. Will Wealthsimple actually turn into a legit bank? We also got a variety of other questions around Wealthsimple submitted. I think that's the most succinct question here, is like, is Wealthsimple going to pull this off? First they were ignored, then they were mocked, and now they have like approval from the Bank of Canada to do direct settlements. Is this the moment, Rob? Have we finally got a competitor to the Big Five? Are they gonna pull this off? Are they gonna be the bank that Canadians need, if not the ones that Canadians want?
I mean, if there's anyone who can do it, it seems like they're the ones.
Why is that?
Why?
Yeah.
Well capitalized. They've built a brand around their trust from a cohort of humans that trust them. So they've got lots of different products. They're a relatively trusted brand. They are not going anywhere despite a couple of write-downs this year. They have a lot of Canadians' money invested with them, and they're backed by pretty stable backers. And so if there's a chance in the near future of a challenger bank coming along and contending with the FIs, the incumbent financial institutions, it seems like Wealthsimple is as well positioned as anyone could be. The question becomes, can our competition policy, would that be used as a cudgel to stop those kinds of things? The settlement is an important piece of the puzzle, but even Mike Katchen said, the real-time rails is necessary. There's a bunch of components that are necessary, and it's taking a very long time despite the open banking conversations happening. So, and they're trying to accelerate, as we've discussed at Elevate, as you discussed on your panel at Elevate, as we've discussed on the show. So I think they are best positioned to do it. I don't know the question is how long. And I think the financial institutions have time, and that's what they lean on as the metric they just need to wait everyone out.
Yeah.
And Wealthsimple needs to survive long enough, and they're well capitalized enough that they probably can, to do all the fights that they need to do to get there. And hopefully, like most companies, when tech companies or whatever, it's about luck and timing. Will the winds shift in their favor from a regulatory perspective in time for them to be able to make a move before the other banks have figured out what their strategies are to compete with themselves? And will they have flanker brands just like they already kind of do, just like the telcos do, like we've discussed with Tony Lacavera? What do you think? Would you bet on them being the ones?
Well, it's an interesting component you're talking about, that pressure of timing. I kind of almost see it the other way in relation to what we were talking about previously, where that kind of growth at all costs, keep pushing, doesn't really factor in when you're talking about this type of fintech. Obviously they want to grow their customer base, but if they create a lifetime relationship with that, banks don't go anywhere. Like the death and taxes for a reason, right? So I think that allows them to play a little bit longer game with some of the things that they've been doing. And to the point of the competition as policy, competition in terms of like access to compete, I think they have been ahead of many others in the space in terms of setting up the regulatory approvals and doing things in the right way. Like it is very notable, and it was certainly one of our most popular stories
Do
this month.
you have a sense of why that might be? Is it because they're of their backers, because they're so well capitalized, because they're...
Yeah, I think they're coming with significant financial services experience here, and like again, initially starting with like Paul Desmarais money, like they have the channels to understand where the power draws, and they've been working for quite some time in terms of setting this stuff up. Like whether it was the first to get the crypto exemption in Canada, just today they became the first regulated Canadian crypto platform to offer staking, which the OSC and others have said, like, you know, like they're the only crypto company offering staking right now regulated by Canada, which could mean something to Canadians. This is at a time where we also just published a major feature. I want to shout out Josh Scott today on WonderFi, their CEO swap, and they're looking to pursue staking as well as a bunch of other things, including iGaming, sports betting, things like that, just future revenue opportunities. That is, they're announcing their desire to pursue that the day that Wealthsimple has it. And they're also looking to do things that are a little bit outside the portfolio of what Wealthsimple's trying to do. Remember, this question was framed as like, are they going to turn into a legit bank? I asked that Mike Ketchum that question every time I talk to him. And he's always said, do we have to have a banking license to be a better bank? Which is interesting. I don't know if they're going to be the first Canadian fintech to pursue a banking license, but they're pursuing every other regulatory pathway. And it's in service of very specific features that they want to build. When we covered the direct settlements, we had Fatima Zaidi, I believe, who is responsible for their payment stuff at Wealthsimple, basically saying, you know, this direct settlement stuff, while it's still going to require real-time rails, is going to set us up for a bunch of other features that we want to roll out. Wage disbursement, instant bill pay, a bunch of other things. That's coming from Wealthsimple's... Sorry, did I say it was Hannah's 80?
Yeah, I was going to say Fatima is the podcaster. I was just looking it up.
I got the wrong Zadie on my mind. But Chief Compliance Officer of Payments saying like, this is great for us in anticipation of the things that we want to do when these other things. So they are laying this out 4 moves ahead. I would also note wage disbursement, instant bill pay, a bunch of other things, banking license or no. That's some really bank stuff. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So
all circling the wagons around.
Do you need to have a banking license to build a better bank? That's Mike Ketchum's sentiment. I guess we'll find out. But I think whether they turn into what is legit? Are they going to turn into a legit bank, or are they going to be a legitimate banking alternative for Canadians? And I think they're pretty close now. If you look at some of their demographic numbers on the percentage of millennials that are using Wealthsimple versus the alternatives.
Let's segue into another hard question that we got from James in the chat. His point is, we've actually talked about this quite a bit, including with Vass and Sean a couple episodes ago. The federal government is doing a lot of different tech policy regulation work right now.
Oh God,
AI, privacy, online
James
harm,
is feeling
streaming.
Himself. He's got a Negroni in hand, and he's just like,
yes.
I'm just going to throw these questions out.
That's right. What is the most interesting or exciting tech regulation proposal that you've seen? And cite the section. I'm just joking. And is there a really good idea that you support?
Jesus Christ.
No.
James and I are going to have a long talk after this podcast. Much appreciation. I also showed up, I should note, during our Twitter Spaces AMA episode.
Yes.
I'll say tech policy regulation work is very interesting because there is the regulation of like tech companies and what we're seeing in Quebec with like language policy inhibiting Quebec companies trying to hire. You might read a story on Friday about a Quebec company that raised some funding to help with labor issues. Quebec-based company receiving financing from Quebec investors in a province that's like currently undermining their talent pool because of these language laws. You've got Alberta. What's going on there? What is a software engineer? What is an engineer? who can claim rights to certain titles, and do they need to be sued if they look to post job recs for software engineers? All of that aside, I think the most interesting stuff happening in Canada right now is around all the bills that the Heritage Minister has been forwarding when it comes to regulating Facebook with the news, regulating platforms like YouTube and TikTok when it comes to content creators. I think that is more directly impactful in the lives of everyday Canadians. Hopefully, the outcome will be a modernization of our approach to Canadian media in the 20th century, carving out a space for our unique identity, not only separate from the US, but like all the global content that you can now access on the internet and like the platforms that control that. I think that is the most interesting battleground, because the decisions being made right now will last until the next platforms come. So it's really important. Am I optimistic about how that stuff is going, whether it's the news bill or the content stuff? No, not really. I would note to everyone that when a global social platform threatens to cut off access to news or to de-platform creators because of a federal law or regulation, is that an indication that the federal law and regulation is poorly planned, or that the platform is looking to strike fear and use its leverage because they don't want an outcome to happen? Like, let's think this through a little bit. That speaks a lot to our relationship with tech companies and tech CEOs and Elon Musks of the world as like the drivers of social and political discourse, rather than, I don't know, our democracies living right now in a city that had just reelected a mayor that no one is really excited for, that papers in Ontario didn't even cover the myriad elections that were going on throughout the province. Like, we have some real issues with information and content and social cohesion as fueled or inhibited by tech. That's where it's at for me. Don't ask me to discuss any of those bills in detail or by name, because I will hang myself. But that's where the heat is for me. And I think that's where it might be for James as well. Oh, look at this. We've got another question not from James. Sarah Scott. I want to shout out people who are just showing up for this. We really appreciate you, by the way, just showing up to hang out with us on LinkedIn late on a Wednesday night. This is from Sarah Scott. She's a branding communications manager at a company I can't read because the window's too small. And her question is, what do you think the Canadian government should be doing in the next year to support tech entrepreneurs? Okay, this is kind of playing upon the previous question. I guess I would ask, do they need to be doing anything to support tech entrepreneurs? If you were to ask VCs, they would say, hey, VCCI, that's a really big deal. I don't know if Canadian entrepreneurs need any sort of direct support right now as a sector, as a category. Certainly, like starting a business, tax planning, there's a lot of like stuff that the government could do. Like day one, if you want to become an entrepreneur, they could make it really easy to do that and not a giant pain in your butt. But I think the biggest thing, and looking at it because we've been covering the sector by sector reports across Canada through our partnership with Briefed-In, which is now owned by Communitech Disclosure, of just how much early stage venture funding in this country is eating it. The deals and the dollars are not there. And now there's a consideration here. We only have what's being publicly reported. A lot of people don't want to put that heat out there, but still the numbers are way below what we would want. And I just go back to 2019 when provinces across the country cut commitments to organizations and support to generate grassroots entrepreneurship. And are we, seeing the results of that now? Yeah, I think so. Plus COVID. I would say like let's get back to making it really, really easy for people to start businesses, to create jobs, and have that support.
I think two things. One is the more drawing a direct line from what you're saying. I think that, I think we've conflated, as a society, we conflate venture investment with entrepreneurship. And I've, complained a lot about the co-opting the term startup to mean anything that's an entrepreneur. I think that there is a place in our society for high growth technology companies with venture backing. But to your point, can be many other vehicles for entrepreneurship, especially now that we've gotten over the tech hump and anybody can start a tech company. So I think that it didn't seem that the superclusters, I'm not sure if that thing actually manifested the ROI that the government really wanted.
They're not even superclusters anymore. They're just normal clusters. See our previous podcasts. Yes. Superclusters is a cluster.
I'm saying this is the nicest way I can.
That's fine. I can say it.
We need to think about innovation beyond venture capital and sort of co-investing that way. I think there's ways to build businesses now that doesn't require a storefront and doesn't require venture capital. There's something happy in the middle. And I think that there's ways to innovate with financing. Like to this day, you go to a bank, and if you want to start any kind of company, they ask you for your house or your car or your kidney as debt. As a Canadian, to take risk to start any company, and I mean any company, it is still as it was 100 years ago.
Try getting a bank account for that debt or a business card. Check out our feature story on Float tomorrow morning, and maybe their growth will speak to.
There you go.
There's a lot of conditions.
Didn't even know, and I'm impressed. So the point is, like, actually champion entrepreneurs in this country, because that actually is what makes the country go round. The other thing that is kind of orthogonal but completely related is our healthcare system is falling apart.
Yes.
And the reason I bring that up is one of the competitive advantages we have, especially after living in America, in this country, is the fact that we have healthcare that is paid for by the state, and benefits are a little sprinkle on top of it that a company can afford to provide on top of that. If we are required to pay for our healthcare out of pocket, it becomes a very expensive proposition to start a business in this country. And the risk becomes that much more for the entrepreneur, because now they have to also pay for their healthcare, their staff's healthcare. And why would you take that risk, especially if you have any kind of health problem? So I think that solving the healthcare problem and removing the bottom ends of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Can I eat? If I'm sick, will I be looked after? Let's try to make us less worried about that kind of stuff and more worried about what is the thing that I can do to make this country better. The one last thing I'll say about the policy stuff, just to the previous point, I just want to say one thing.
Go for it.
I really think we have an opportunity to become a thought leader, because we said we were a few years ago in artificial intelligence, and specifically the ethics of artificial intelligence. If we want to own the discussion around AI around the world beyond just our algorithms, I think we have an opportunity to say, here's what a AI framework. So I completely agree with you with news and censorship and CanCon. We'll call this podcast CanCon again. But can we take a leading role in what these technologies look like, and don't just act as a recipient of whatever other countries have done, like GDPR and CCPA? Like, can we actually come up with policies that affect the way that our children are going to live and affect the rest of the world, so we actually have control over what's going on, as opposed to having to just tweak it for Canada?
Yeah, great point. And I want to shout out, that was Sarah Scott from Accelerate Okanagan.
Thank you. Oh,
Thank
awesome.
you,
Let's go visit.
I clicked through the profile, saw the full name and bio. I was like, oh, it's Sarah. Thank you for that question. But to that point, and I think we're trying to backfill some of our personal picadillos here.
Yes.
We had this one question submitted by one Emily Key. She has a wonderful podcast that you should check out called The F Word. Listen to those episodes. Maybe one day she'll invite me on. Her question was, what aren't we talking about in tech right now that you wish we were? And I think I wanted to highlight that out and jump in the order of the question asking, because I feel like some of the answers that we've been giving are related to that. Whether it's like tech solutions to our healthcare problem, because crippling austerity and privatization is not the answer. And or, hey, our systems of social cohesion through news and information and connectivity are really fucked right now due to social media platforms, and democracies won't get better unless people can get on the same page about the current state of things. I think about that all the time, and I wish we were talking about it more. Being entirely apathetic to local elections and seeing media companies apathetic to that as well, seeing them not cover federal bills that would directly impact them financially in relationship to Facebook or anyone else is really disappointing. We're going to have a guest on soon in the coming weeks who's trying to fix the internet by changing the structure for how we consume information. I'm very excited by that prospect and very skeptical about their capacity to succeed because of, the history of the internet and how easy it is to be taken advantage of. But I wish we were talking more about the things not in front of us, but that create the systems of conversation. And man, I'm on Twitter all day. I'm in front of this computer all the time. I go to play video games to de-stress. I am always connected to the information superhighway, and it is very hard to get context and perspective if you don't step away. But stepping away isn't the answer either, because there's crazy shit going on all the time. So I wish we were really talking about how we wanted to order some of these systems of society, whether it comes along government, business, technological lens, because if we talk about this all the time, the power of technology is its scale and reach. And if we're not talking about those things complementary with each other, we're actually not solving any problems. So yeah, I wish we were talking about that a lot fucking more. Rob, other than the things we mentioned, do you have some other topics that you're like, you know what? Shred really needs...
No, I think we covered shocking amount, actually, much more than I was expecting given the questions. No, I think it's a good point to leave it on. I think that the move fast and break things has done exactly that. Moved fast and broken things. And I think we now know you can't just storm the barn with new ideas and totally destroy society. And I think we all understand the consequences. The thing that we all have to figure out now is, how do we have a reliable and consistent conversation amongst ourselves and the government, that, you know, the policies that we create and the, you know, impact groups that try to influence those policies, and how do we have a voice as a society where we can sort of balance all the needs of all players and understand that we're not done the disruption yet, but how do we ingest disruption as it comes? Like Web3 will probably be more disruptive than a bunch of other stuff when it does manifest itself. So how can we put those guardrails in about what's okay or what's not okay? What does society actually want? It's hard because it's hard to understand some of the things you get out of Web3 until you see it and feel it. But we can have some guardrails about how you impinge new technology on societies. And it's also worth noting that tech is a loaded term in the sense that it's not technology per se that's really changed everything. It's also different business models. Like Uber wasn't really technology. It was assembling a bunch of stuff.
No, but the medium is the message and the approach to building that company and breaking all the laws. It's all, everything's connected.
That's what I'm saying. I'm saying like tech it's a loaded word. There's more in it than just tech. And I think that's what we've learned over time, that it's not just I have a smartphone. It's all the things that come along with it.
Yeah. And honestly, the focus of this podcast, I would hope that our listeners, our viewers right now appreciate the ways that we've been trying to expand and enhance the focus of this podcast, take different approaches to content, doing the AMAs, doing the panel conversations, doing the one-on-one
guests who aren't obviously nerdy technologists.
That we are 100% committed to digging into that. And we would love feedback on what you're liking and not liking, so we can do more of it, this included. If you enjoyed this, leave a comment. If you wish my camera was in focus, I already know, don't leave a comment on that. But yeah, this is the conversation that we want to be having, and we want to have great people on to discuss it with us, so it's not just two middle-aged white guys talking this through. So if you've got guest recommendations, spam the chat right now, because I think this gets saved and we will definitely reach out to them. Rob, to close this off, do you want to ask the final question? I know we kind of left it on a good point, but I think we can 140 characters this question.
Is anyone going back to a physical office?
Absolutely fucking not. Thanks, everybody. We really appreciate you showing up for this, what was ostensibly a tech test that we broadcasted live to also record a podcast. Stay tuned. We've got really cool things coming. We're doing a live podcast in Ottawa for SAS North. If you like this, but don't want to be on LinkedIn at 8:00 in the evening, why don't you join us at the breakfast day 2 of SAS North? So at 8 a.m. in the morning, you can throw questions at us in person and get fed what I hope is a hot breakfast. We'll see you there, and we'll see you on the next one. Thank you so much. The BetaKit Podcast is produced by BetaKit Incorporated. It's edited by Katie Lohr, and its hosts are Rob Kennedy and me, Douglas Saltis. To learn more about how you can support this podcast, head to patreon.com/BetaKit.